Welcome everybody to Ant 200. Today we are going to continue our conversation about globalization by contextualizing ideas about connectivity and world systems in the past. So to get us started here, the term globalization has become pretty commonplace in the last 30 years among academics who use the idea to describe how trade and technology have made the world into a more connected and interdependent place. Globalization also captures in its scope the economic, social, and environmental changes that have come about as a result of this increased interconnectedness. It may be pictured as the threads of a kind of immense spider web formed over millennia, with the number and reach of each of these threads increasing over time. People, money, material goods, ideas, even disease and devastation have traveled along these kind of strands and have done so in greater numbers and with greater speed than ever before in the present age. Globalization, however, itself is not a modern idea. The Silk Road, used between 50 BC and 250 CE, is perhaps the most well-known early example of globalization. The Silk Route is over 8,000 kilometers long and is a network of roads in Eurasia, connecting Eastern and Southern Asia with the Mediterranean world. The road itself stretches from Shenyang in China across the Taklamakan Desert, over the Pamir Mountains, through the grasslands of Central Asia, into Persia, and then to the Mediterranean, with branches in the northern Eurasian steppes, as well as India. As with future kind of globalizing booms, new technologies played a key role in the Silk Road trade. Advances in metallurgy led to the creation of coins. Advances in transportation led to the building of roads, connecting the major empires of the day. And increased agricultural production meant more food could be trafficked between different locations. The Silk Road was the channel through which silk textiles and yarn were exported from ancient Chinese empires of the Han Dynasty and later the Tang Dynasty to the Western Persia, India, and the Mediterranean. Christianity, prevalent in Western Europe at this time, also helped in the expansion of the silk market. Churches stored silks in their treasuries as a form of wealth, and the devotees were encouraged to donate silk to these early churches. Along with silk, Roman glass and Arabian spices, as well as ideas such as Buddhist beliefs and technologies like Chinese papermaking, printing, and gunpowder, as well as the compass and windmills, were all transported west. Anthropologists and archaeologists have typically drawn on an approach called world systems theory to understand how globalization works. World systems theory is what's called a macro-sociological perspective that seeks to explain the dynamics of the capitalist world economy as a total social system. Its first major articulation and classic example of this approach is associated with the work of Immanuel Wallerstein. In 1976, Wallerstein published The Modern World Systems, Capitalist Agriculture and the Origins of the European World Economy in the 16th Century. Wallerstein's goal was to develop a new theoretical paradigm to guide our studies of the emergence and development of capitalism, industrialism, and modern world nation-states. According to Wallerstein, the modern nation-state exists within a broader economic, political, and legal framework, which he called a world systems. Wallerstein believed that there are only three basic types of social systems: mini-systems, world empires, and world economies. The first concept of the mini-system refers to small, kind of homogeneous societies that are often studied by anthropologists. A world empire system had an economy that is based on an extraction of surplus goods and services from outlying conquered districts. Much of this tribute that's acquired from these outlying districts goes to pay for the administrators who extract it, and for the military needed to ensure continued domination. The rest of that money goes to political rulers at the head of the empire. Finally, the third type of social system, a world economy, is different from a world empire in that it does not have a unified political system. And it doesn't try to dominate other nations through military power alone. However, like a world empire, a world economy is based on the extraction of surplus from outlying districts to extract those resources and to bring them in to a kind of central economy. Wallerstein argues that the capitalist world system began in Europe in about 1500, and under the spur of the accumulation of capital, expanded over the next few centuries to cover the entire globe. In the process of this expansion, the capitalist world system absorbed small mini-systems, as well as world empires. The capitalist world economy was created by establishing long-distance trade in goods and linking production processes worldwide, all of which allowed for the significant accumulation of capital in Europe. But these economic relationships were, of course, not created in a vacuum. The modern nation state was created in Europe, along with capitalism, to serve and protect the interests of the capitalists. What was in the interest of early European capitalists was the establishment of a world economy based on an extremely unequal division of labor between European states and the rest of the system. Also in the interest of early European capitalists was the establishment of strong European states that had the political and military might to enforce this inequality. The capitalist world system is based on an inter-regional and transnational division of labor, which divides the world into core countries, semi-peripheries, and peripheral countries. Peripheral states are exploited by the core for their cheap labor, raw materials, and agricultural production. Semi-peripheral areas are somewhat intermediate, being both exploited by the core as well as taking some role in the exploitation of the peripheral areas. In the recent past, these kind of semi-peripheries have been expanding their manufacturing activities, particularly in products that core nations no longer find very profitable. The core states, finally, are in geographically advantageous areas of the world, places like Europe and North America. These core states have strong central governments, powerful militaries, complex state institutions, and are highly industrialized. These core states promote capital accumulation internally through tax policy, government purchasing, sponsorship of research and development, financing, and maintaining social order to minimize class struggle. Core states also promote capital accumulation in the world economy itself. According to Emanuel Wallerstein, a core state is dominant over all the others when it has a lead in three forms of economic dominance. So there's three types of dominance: productivity, trade, and financial dominance. Productivity dominance allows a country to develop higher quality products at a cheaper price compared to other countries. Productivity dominance may lead to trade dominance. In this case, there's a favorable balance of trade for the dominant state since other countries are buying more of its products than from anybody else. Trade dominance may lead to financial dominance. At this point, more money is flowing into the core country than is leaving it. Bankers from the dominant state tend to acquire greater control over the world's financial resources. It is the economic, political, and military power of the core that allows significant capital to be accumulated in the hands of the few. The capitalist world system that produces and maintains these gross economic and political inequalities is therefore created through this interconnection between productivity, trade, and financial dominance. So take a few seconds to think a little bit about what some of the differences are that you can think of between world systems and globalization today and world systems and globalization in the past. We'll talk a little bit about this as we continue throughout the lecture. So what is lacking in early globalized systems was the ability of a core to completely dominate and incorporate a periphery in the same way that European states like Great Britain absorbed various colonies like Barbados and Jamaica in the capitalist world system starting in the 16th century. This was because early states didn't have fully developed institutions that would allow them to manipulate local conditions at great distances from the home area. As a result, core groups probably had to decide which of several industries they wanted to kind of dominate and focus their efforts on those areas. For instance, in the Aegean region during the Bronze Age, the elites of small centers typically expended most of their economic efforts on controlling the production and distribution of bronze and textiles. The archaeological evidence from various Mycenaean palaces indicates that these centers regulated the acquisition, production, and distribution of these commodities. The working of bronze and the production of woolen textiles were under the direct authority of the centers, with workshops located at the palaces or at outlying communities, but all under centralized control. The production of obsidian tools in the Aegean Bronze Age was another matter entirely. While such implements were critically important to the daily economic activities of the main population, production was not under palace control. Without a fully developed administrative structure, the Mycenaean centers had to focus their efforts on the activities that generated the highest return. To a greater or lesser degree, this was probably true of all early states. They didn't have the military, political, and economic wherewithal to fully dominate peripheries at any great distance from the centers, and especially not for extended periods of time. On those occasions when such dominance was in effect, it typically didn't last long. A second key difference between modern and ancient world systems was the nature of technology in antiquity. Whereas modern production sites often involve massive installations that are not easily moved, ancient systems were often capable of relatively easy dispersal and focused more on the exchange of portable goods. For instance, early bronze work could be accomplished using small crucibles that could be easily moved to different workshops in different places. In addition, certain expensive commodities like frankincense were available only in remote spots, most easily accessed by local populations with intimate knowledge of source locations. These factors made domination of the resources virtually impossible for cores, especially at a great distance. Cores in the ancient world were dependent on the peripheries for access, and this gave them the ability to negotiate both the nature and extent of their integration into the larger system. This process was even evident in early phases of the modern capitalist system. For example, throughout much of the 16th and 17th centuries here in North America, Native people controlled access to the furs that Europeans desired as part of the burgeoning fur trade in Europe. Natives trapped the animals and prepared the hides. They bargained shrewdly for European commodities and services that they wanted in return. This ability to negotiate the status of their involvement in a world system gave Native people a degree of control that one does not typically associate with peripheries. Archaeology in particular has helped to illuminate one of the key features of world systems theory, specifically the idea that world systems tend to expand and contract over time. Systems grow through the process of incorporation, expanding the network of relationships. Such growth has the benefit of bringing more resources, both material, human, and informational, into the core. Growth also creates strain on the system because of the need to expend more energy and resources in order to maintain the connections that have been established. When the costs become excessive, the system will contract, shedding its peripheries. At times, certain peripheries are between competing cores and will switch back and forth in their allegiance and control. These oscillations in power and control are symptoms of system instability and appear regularly in the ancient world. For instance, in the Aegean, we see the expansion of cities with the early Bronze Age, followed by a period of collapse near the end of the second millennia BC, roughly the same time as the Egyptian First Intermediate period. Then the Middle Bronze Age, we see a kind of effervescence of the culture, which terminates in a system-wide collapse around 1100 to 1200 BC. This ushers in a period known as the Greek Dark Ages. The ensuing geometric period and Dark Ages is a time of reorganization that eventually leads to an explosion in colonization during the Archaic period, when Greek city-states established settlements from the Black Sea into the larger Mediterranean and southern France and Spain. A 2011 book by the Royal Ontario Museum curator Justin Jennings addresses the issue of globalization in the past directly, especially this idea of pulsating systems, systems that expand and collapse. Jennings examines what he calls plural globalizations, variations in globalizations at different times in the past. Drawing on world systems approaches, he argues that it is possible to identify earlier phases of large-scale integration by looking for a dramatic increase in interregional interaction, as well as social changes that are associated with the creation of these interactions. A key case study for Jennings is Uruk Warqa in Iraq, arguably the earliest city in Mesopotamia that dates to 4500 BC. Uruk Warqa has a city center surrounded by 6 miles of satellite villages, and at its height had a population somewhere around 80,000 people. The city itself is divided into multiple districts, the Iana and the Anu districts. The Iana district was a walled part of the city that was separated from the rest of the areas that were more inhabited. This part of the city was dedicated to the god Ainu, Iana's grandfather. Within the city was a central ziggurat complex used as a storehouse, temple, and redistribution center, which employed hundreds of craft workers and was organized around a well-defined hierarchy. At the height of its influence between 4000 and 3000 BC, workers at Uruk Warqa were mass-producing bevel-rimmed bowls that are found throughout the region. These bowls were used to measure payments to workers made in grain. Around 8000 BC, we see the appearance of clay tokens used to record commercial dealings. These clay envelopes were carried on strings. Around 3000 BC, we also have evidence for early forms of writing using cuneiform. These cuneiform tablets were used to record occupations, places, and transactions. And around 2000 BC, we see cuneiform being expanded to document other types of activities linked to the burgeoning settlement, including military victories, land transactions, love stories, and epic poems. Around 3500 BC, metalworking develops, with copper being used to create high-status items. Around 2000 BC, alloying was developed and used to produce bronze. This development of bronze weapons is likely linked to the rise of interstate warfare in the region. The large and varied urban population at Uruk stimulated production and exchange both locally and over great distances. These processes are seen archaeologically in burial goods that reflect a creeping level of social differentiation. The use of seals suggests increased bureaucratic control, and the ubiquitous bevel-rimmed bowls for transporting basic foodstuffs. The economic and social ferment in Uruk reverberated well beyond the city through colonization, assimilation, and other processes. The nature of the Uruk expansion varied from place to place as people selectively accepted and rejected various elements of Uruk culture. Ultimately, Jennings' world systems theory suggests that the emergence of cities with their multiple needs and complex webs of relations led to previously unknown levels of interregional interaction. Through the long-distance movement of people, goods, and ideas, cities expanded the system and accelerated the interaction between urban dwellers, people in the hinterlands, and those far more distant groups.